Hello, my name is Bear Shea, and I am the Mental Health and School Counselor Specialist at the Maine DOE. And this is a conversation about leadership and COVID-19 crisis. As a mental health clinician and clinical director for a public day treatment level program, as well as a speaker and trainer, I've had the opportunity to support leaders across the country in developing effective strategies for managing barriers and increasing leadership effectiveness. My goal in this conversation is really to explain some of the unique situations that the COVID crisis has brought about for leadership and highlight some of the ways that we can increase our supports and our effectiveness as leaders. I'm going to make this conversation as fast-paced as possible because I know that time is a priority. And so though I hope that there's lots of information in here that you will be able to use that's sort of helpful for your staff and for other people, I'm really hoping that you take some time to listen to this for yourself as a leader in the education field and at least go through it once just for you. So that being said, I think we should start this conversation by just looking at some of the ways that the COVID-19 crisis has really impacted how we are thinking and talking about things. I think one of the biggest ones that I hear a lot is that this is the new normal. This is what we should be getting used to, and this is we need to shift into this idea that this is all normal. And I think there's a difficulty in that construct, in that I think all of the things that we're experiencing, feeling, and particularly a lot of these new responsibilities that we're taking on as leaders in education, they're not normal. They are unique to this crisis. And the COVID-19 crisis has really embedded itself in the very fiber of all of our everyday lives, and that is a significant impact on us. And it's important to acknowledge that. It's important to acknowledge that this is an ongoing crisis, that we're still in the middle of it. And as that a crisis exists, we should expect it to have certain effects on us. Some of the ways those effects look are fear and anxiety, perseveration, that worry of not being able to plan, running through the back of our head, changes in our sleeping and eating patterns, thinking about mental health conditions that are struggling, chronic health problems, the effects that this has on us physically, emotionally, and cognitively. All of those impacts are things that we expect from human beings during a crisis. And the longer that crisis goes, the more significant these barriers are. And this is something we have a lot of research on and are aware of. If these things aren't coming up for us, we should be worried. It means that we're not paying attention. And that's something that we're going to talk a lot about in this conversation, about how are we paying attention to what's going on for us so that we can be at our very best. So if these are the things that we're expecting, then how do we lead during this crisis? How do we connect and understand with what's going on for us as human beings and still be able to provide support and ongoing direction? And I think that's one of the things that we need to be aware of, is that the unique qualities of this crisis really have a different effect on us and on the people around us than we're used to. As Mainers, we're really good at dealing with short-term crises, weather events, losing power for weeks at a time. We band together as community, and it's really some of the places that we shine. And even as a country, we're used to short-term events. We're used to hurricanes and tornadoes, and even some of the worst things that have happened over a short period of time. And so this idea of a crisis that's extending over months and may continue months more is something that's largely new for us. Unfortunately, there is a lot of data on how human beings respond to these long-term crises, and that there are other times in history and other places in the world that deal with these crises regularly. And I want to share with you a graphic that I think really helps explain the process that we go through during this kind of a crisis. So we can see this graphic it's been around for 20 years or so, and it's time and time again has shown the process that we human beings go through. And you can sort of see the emotional highs and emotional lows and the engagement in the material. And January, as we were hearing more and more about the COVID-19 virus and the way that it was impacting other places in the world, and as that threat sort of came in. And then once it hit, we really saw this huge spike and this coming together and unifying communities and, unifying as the state and as a country, and really engaging and trying, in social distancing and changing our messaging, and our commercials on TV changed, and we started staying home more and more. And then what's happened is that over time, those numbers continued to go up, and we continued to struggle and watch the death toll increase and the infection rate increase. And we've really now come down into this disillusionment phase. And this is a sort of a normal part of this cycle of dealing with crisis, where the ongoing nature of it has really exhausted our emotional capacity. And so we're seeing, people engaging in, isolated movements and trying to increase mask wearing, or trying to, engage in community events. And so we're seeing these ups and downs. And as these things continue on, this just dragging of emotional low and engagement in this disillusionment phase. And we're pretty well in here, and it looks like we may be here for a while longer. And so understanding that all of us that are experiencing this crisis are sort of in this phase in one space or another is useful information when we're talking about how we're going to engage as leaders, but also how we're examining where we're at for ourselves, and then how we're going to want to look at a transition. So that being said, as we move over and we start thinking about, how we are engaging with people, and that we're humans who are supporting other humans. And that means for us as leaders, we tend to be caretakers, and we tend to be, in education, we come from a space of really caring about our students and our staff and our communities, and really looking at what's best for kids. And that's something that we're good at, but sometimes we're really not often good at taking care of ourselves. And I don't think that that's unique to leaders in general, but I think particularly in the education field, because we come from a space of caring about others, we tend to really fall into that category. I know sort of the idea of an oxygen mask analogy where, we're supposed to put the mask on ourselves before helping the person next to us. I think this really speaks to us as leaders taking care of ourselves so that we're at our best, making sure that our brain and its response to this crisis as a human is taken into consideration with how we want to be moving forward as leaders. And this is really a biological response. All of us during this crisis, the survival parts of our brain, they're firing a lot. Human beings do not like to be in a place where we can't plan, where we don't understand what's going on. And that's really some of the difficulties that have come out of this crisis. Knowing that how we react to stress and how that survival response kicks on, are we more sort of in that fight or flight place where the energy kind of really builds up in us and we get stressed out and we either want to drop everything and get out, or we want to get in and just fight and go for something? Or do we fit more on sort of the freeze or submit as a protection, where we tend to sort of lock down and hyper focus, or just really dig into work and go and go and go and go and go until we can find an answer? And just knowing that these are parts that are in our brain that are strategic ways of our brain keeping us safe, and that the more stress there is, the more in that sort of reactive brain we're in, and less in the actual thinking and rational part of our brain. And that's something to really be aware of as we get tired and as the load continues on us. And that's the piece, is that we are carrying a significant mental load. Not only do we have our own families and our own health to consider, but as educators, we are aware of how this COVID crisis is affecting our students and our staff, and our communities, and that's a different load than we would have if we were in the business community. We're really aware of the integral role that schools play in our community and how important they are for some of the basic needs that our students and their families need. And I think another piece of that is, what are our needs and processes? How do we examine how we're meeting our needs, and so that that reactive part of our brain, those survival responses, aren't driving our thought process, so that we have our whole brain online and regulated, so that we're making the best decisions and that we are at our strongest as leaders. So knowing that this is how things are affecting us, how do we actually lead? How do we actually start to look at the process with how we're intentionally moving forward? And, really understanding that we are leading humans, but that we are also human ourselves. And what that means as far as paying attention to what our needs are, so that we're at our best. And a lot of this is going back to some of the fundamental ideas of intentionally remembering what were the things that brought us to be leaders in the first place. How do we connect with those base level parts, with our passions? Why did we choose this in the first place? What's the kind of leader that we've striven to be? And who are our role models? Those are some of the key ideas. They're like foundational for us, and connecting to them helps ground us and helps our brain not feel like it's in such a frantic mode. What are other spaces that we've been successful in? This is not the first time we've had barriers. Granted, this one is particularly unique. But what are other successes that we've had? Thinking about those, getting ourselves settled and solid. Thinking about what are the things that fill our passion? How are we getting that energy back as we're expending it? And really thinking about those relationships that we have and how they connect us to our communities and our decisions. It's something that's going on in the back of our mind all the time as leaders, is taking care and protecting. But knowing and thinking about those relationships intentionally can help ground us in this time. Ultimately, the biggest piece of this is the responsibility. And the responsibility part of COVID-19 is really unique. It has really changed a lot of our role and the expectations, and a lot of the ways that we used to interact, and really thrown them on their head, and just increased the responsibility and stress on us. Knowing that there's this massive coordination that is going on that we're expected to engage in and organize and somehow be on top of, all of these gears that are part of a system that we're used to. We're used to managing multiple different systems and getting them all to work together and finding the way to do that. But with COVID, it has really blown all of that to a massive scale. We're working with CDC, we're connecting with federal and local, and trying to put together all of these things while not really having a firm ground to even plan on, and having to come up with multiple different plans at the same time. We're also dealing with the responses that not only we're having, but that our staff are struggling with, and that balance between emotional responses and rational responses. And as we get stressed out as individuals, we tend to edge towards one side or the other. We'll either get caught up with the emotional responses and the intensity of it, or we'll sort of ignore the emotional pieces and really focus on the rational of like, these are the things that we have to do now. Our brains are at their best when we're able to access both of those sides, and our decision making is its strongest when we can really be intentional in accessing the strengths from both of those areas. We also know that there's just this massive feedback loop right now, that we're making decisions that are going out there that are being cross-examined, judged, and thrown right back at us all the time. And while we're used to getting feedback, this seems to be at a much more extreme level, and that's really important to notice. And then I think the biggest one that I am hearing from leadership in the field is the concern and the intensity of making decisions that really could be life or death. And I think we're used to intense intense conversations, and we're used to making decisions that are significant, that will have impact on students and teachers and our communities. But this is something that's really at a next level. And I know the feedback I've been getting is that this is a level of intensity that a lot of us haven't experienced before. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that. And when we try to ignore or just push through, that's when our brains really start feeling that stress and feeling that pressure. I think, all of these pieces are things that we're aware of on one level or another. And there's a big advantage in really acknowledging that this is what's going on for us. It's been really clear for me working with leadership as a counselor and a clinician in a mental health sense, but then also looking at some of the brain research that when we ignore these stressors and when we just try to push through as we've done in the past, that paired with the length of this crisis, and that this is something that has already gone on significantly and will continue significantly, the wearing capacity it has on our bodies physically and the toll of that stress, it affects all of our well-being and can really have a negative effect on our health. And so that's why we're talking about this. That's why acknowledging these pieces and being aware of them is something that, while it can be initially stressful, can actually significantly help us stay in a rational space and keep our whole brains online and lower the risk for long-term health effects. So another important part of this is looking at that professional versus personal, and how that is something that we've always managed, particularly in education. When we go into a grocery store, we might be having conversations with our community members about things that are going on in the school, or decisions that are happening at the school board level, or it might even just be about our teams. And so we're used to a certain amount of that. However, now there's so much more attention on it, and that crossover between our personal and professional lives, there's not a lot of separation for us. And that paired with sort of the backlash from almost any decision we make, it seems like we're used to, again, like not being able to please everybody and being able to bear that brunt and to take that on. However, with the intensity of what's happening locally at our state and then globally, there's a much more intense backlash, and it just feels just that much more intense than it has in the past. And part of that is just completely related to this unique situation. Part of our role as leaders is being able to protect the other educators that we're working with, and our community and our students, the kids that are growing up around us. And that piece is both us as professionals, but then also that personal belief in our communities in what we're doing. And that it adds that much extra load when things are this intense. And that mental load, the idea that we understand how intense things are, that the impact that this is having on our staff, on our students, on our communities, these are things that are that much higher than they normally are. And I think we have this expectation of what is normal for us and what we're able to do and what we're able to step into when things get difficult. It's that this is its own unique kind of difficult. This is a whole other piece than what we've done before. And so we need to acknowledge that this isn't an experience that we've had. And that there are these tropes sort of strength and leadership, or this idea that we're islands, that, we go down with our ship, that we are unflappable, that, we can bear the brunt of anything. And I think we've been in situations where we've done that. We're in a situation now where we're having to do it over and over and over and over again. And with the added intensity of this responsibility, it's something that can easily wear us down. Added to that, our own self-expectations, and sort of that, that nagging critical voice that's saying, I should be able to do this. I should be able to do more. Why can't I do this? How am I going to make that work? Balls are dropping. There are all these things that are important that are happening that I can't get to. That self-expectation is something that can really start gnawing away at us, and add to that feeling of stress and anxiety, and go back into some of those protective parts of our brain, into that fight or flight or freeze or submit, and so that our brain isn't regulated. And so these are really important things to consider as we're moving forward, and as we're trying to be intentional in being aware of this load. So knowing all of this puts us in a place where, okay, so what are we going to do? What can we actually do about this? And I think that because there's so much crossover now between our personal and professional, part of this is really about how are we leading and living at the same time, and what action steps can we actually take to help support us through this. Acknowledging it is one thing. What are we actually doing? I think part of that acknowledgement is giving ourselves permission. And how do we allow ourselves to understand and expect reactions from us, and to have an emotional response, to have an intensity, a level of intensity that we might not have expected, and really being tolerant of where our physical and emotional limitations are. And that we don't have to be this, edifice of strength, that we really do have limitations. And the more we pay attention to them and are aware of them up front means the less impact we're going to have on a negative, for negative health results, and for our mind to become dysregulated. So paying attention to this on the forefront allows us to have a more regulated response and ultimately extend our life for as long as possible. Understanding that this mental load, it affects everything. We've talked about ACEs studies. We've talked about all of the different ways that we can sort of support our students and support our staff. We need to be part of that as well, and we need to turn that eye on ourselves. This mental load and this extra level of responsibility is absolutely going to impact our physical, our cognitive, our emotional, social, and how we view ourselves. And so being aware of that and really being intentional with allowing ourselves some space to recover and to be proactive with our health is very important. I think one of the traps that often happen with us as leaders is that there's so much to do at all times. There's more to do than we can actually even tackle. And so we feel like we always need to be moving. And what we know from studies is that being in that motion all of the time puts that extra stress on us and can move us into that dysregulated brain. And so we don't always have to move forward. Taking that time and intentionally using it, not just being overloaded and breaking down, but actually intentionally taking time, breathing, connecting. It actually reduces the amount of time that it takes to solve some of these problems, because we're regulating our brain, because we're engaging in things that are healing and that actually increase our capacity, rather than just running ourselves, ragged. And I think oftentimes we can get caught in a cycle where we just realize the next thing needs to be done and we just jump right into it, and we just get into this space of always doing and finding ourselves distracted, and we're running ourselves down and putting our brain in that space of dysregulation. So giving ourselves permission to take that time intentionally so that we can recharge and do what's best for us. These are some other action pieces that that really can help us get into that space. We talked earlier about the trope of being an island and leading in isolation, and there's a real advantage to connecting with others that understand our experience. And that's one of the pieces about where this crisis is at, is that this is something we're all experiencing. And so reaching out and sharing these struggles that we're going through is a really important way of normalizing that intensity, and showing that it's not just something that's on us, but it's something that we are all experiencing, and really finding relationships that are outside of what we do for work and engaging with them in an intentional way and making space for them. Right now, there's no space for anything. We're just maxed out all the time, and then there's still more to do. Research shows over and over and over again that when we take time to actually engage with relationships and connect, it stabilizes us. It allows our brain to move out of a survival space. It gives us access to our whole brain, and actually recharges our parasympathetic nervous system so that we're moving forward and that we're more effective. And so it really is an investment in time to make the rest of our time that much better, to put us in that much stronger of a leadership frame of mind. Of course, everybody, wants to offer, I love when people are like, calm down, or just breathe, or it'll be okay. That's not helpful. And so letting people know that, really want to just keep throwing that at us if that's not so helpful, but also allowing people that are helpful to support us. I think we forget often, as all of these other priorities are in our space, that there are people that are supportive and that we need to intentionally reach out. And I think that's one of the pieces is that, as educators, we talk about self-care all the time. And it's something we promote with our wellness initiatives and all of these pieces. But how many of us in, leadership actually pay attention to our self-care? And yeah, maybe we read a book or we go on a hike, but do we do it intentionally? Is it something that we're actually saying, I need to do this because it is taking care of my brain and my body and making me a stronger leader? And even if we had those things before, where we're at with COVID and the impact on us for the past many months, we need different self-care than we've used in the past, and we need to be intentional about it. And that we're adding those supports and that we're bringing them on board as a way to make us stronger and more stable and better leaders. Particularly if we are feeling overwhelmed and if we're feeling like we're struggling, bringing on people that can help us, that have professional training in how to support us in processing some of these pieces and not becoming overwhelmed. And if we feel like we're out of control or that intensity is really is making us afraid, or that we're having thoughts of hurting ourselves, or hopelessness or wanting to die, really seeking out help. And saying, okay, like this has really gone far enough, and I need some extra help to make sure I can process this, so that that part of our brain that's really running in safety mode doesn't eventually just take over. And so finding help and reaching out for it is really important. So when we look at how do we take on some of these things? What are practical things we can do? It's really, some of the best research in leadership is starting with the fundamentals. And I think, it can be kind of an annoying thing to hear. And I feel sometimes a little guilty for putting it out there. And it's certainly not a condescending piece, but when we start looking at research, it shows that these base level pieces are some of the first things that we lose as we go under stress. How much of us are getting enough sleep, regular physical activity, the food we're putting into our body, the basic fuel, what are other pieces that we're putting into our body, the effective screen time, and really being intentional. These are the core pieces when you look at what are the things that make me the best leader. This is foundational. And it really does go hand in hand with how we're looking at our social and emotional pieces. How do we interact with social media, our own routines, making sure that we're maintaining something that is manageable, that we can keep doing day after day, even though the responsibilities and intensity of stress are far more than we've been familiar with. Finding ways to create those, engage in those relationships that are outside of what we do professionally. These are the base level things. And I know they're fundamentals. None of these are things that we don't know or are surprised with. And yet when we really go down these lists, how many of us can say we've done all of these things? And they're not simple. They're not easy to do. Some of us are working, 18-hour days, day after day. And so how are we intentionally using these basic skills to really engage with our own health and making ourselves the best leaders that we can possibly be? That being said, we at the DOE, we understand how different things are, and all of the nimble changes that have had to be made, that you've engaged in, that you've jumped on board, that you've stepped up for during a time that is unprecedented, during a crisis that has asked more of us than most anything else. And I just want to say personally, and I know from the DOE, that we really appreciate that. And we're working hard at putting supports in place and being open to having communication to figure out what is best for you and your districts, and how we can be supportive of that. So I just like to say, for everything that you're doing to supporting, our students and families and communities. Thank you so much. And I hope there are parts of this that you can really take on board and hear and validate just the level of intensity of where things are at, and use some of these pieces intentionally to just increase your own health and balance for where our brains are at. It's really important. So thanks so much.